Sometimes the loneliest moment in life is when you realize no one is coming to save you. For a widow at a desolate frontier port, that moment arrives as she collapses among weathered crates, her last bit of strength finally gone. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the water, and not a soul has stopped to help. Then a mountain man appears, a hardened stranger who lives alone in the wilderness, who turned his back on people years ago. But something about her still form in the fading light stirs something he thought was dead. Without a word, he lifts her and carries her away from that forsaken place. What could make a man who chose solitude risk everything for a woman he's never met? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. The port town of Bellwater sat at the edge of the world, or so it seemed to those who found themselves there. It was a place of rough timber and rougher men, where the Columbia River met the wilderness and civilization grew thin as mist. The docks groaned under the weight of cargo and broken dreams, and the air always carried the smell of salt, fish, and something closer to despair. Catherine Mercer had arrived in Bellwater 6 days ago with a worn leather satchel, $11, and nowhere else to go. At 47, she'd never imagined herself in such a place, among such people, with such emptiness stretching before her. But then, she'd never imagined being a widow either. The fever had taken Thomas in early spring, back in Independence, Missouri. 1 week he'd been making plans for their journey westland, waiting, a new start, the dreams they'd nurtured through 23 years of marriage. The next week, he was gone. The doctor's bills and burial costs had taken everything. The land deed Thomas had secured was still valid, somewhere up in the mountains north of Bellwater, but Catherine had no way to reach it, no means to work it, and no strength left to try. She'd sold what little they owned and bought passage on a freight wagon, heading to the Oregon Territory, thinking perhaps she could find work in one of the settlements, maybe as a housekeeper or a cook. But Bellwater wasn't that kind of town. It was a way station for trappers, loggers, and men running from something. The few women here were either married to the hardest of those men or working in the saloon, and neither group had much use for a middle-aged widow with calloused hands and a grieving heart. The innkeeper, a thin-lipped woman named Mrs. Holloway, had let Catherine stay 3 nights on credit before demanding payment. When Catherine couldn't produce it, she'd been turned out with barely concealed satisfaction. "This ain't a charity house, Mrs." Holloway had said, her voice sharp as the wind off the water. "You want to stay, you work it off in the kitchen, or you move along." Catherine had tried the kitchen work, 2 days of it, scrubbing pots from before dawn until after dark, sleeping on a pallet in the storage room, eating scraps. But even that hadn't lasted. Mrs. Holloway's nephew had arrived needing work, and blood ran thicker than charity. Catherine found herself back on the street with her satchel and even less money than before. She'd spent the last 3 days looking for anything, any kind of work, any place to sleep that didn't cost what she didn't have. The portmaster, a thick-necked man with tobacco-stained teeth, had looked her up and down with eyes that made her skin crawl. "Might have something for you?" he'd said, his meaning clear enough that Catherine had backed away and kept walking. The general store didn't need help. The blacksmith laughed at the suggestion. The timber office didn't hire women. Door after door closed, and with each refusal, Catherine felt herself disappearing a little more. By the 6th day, she'd stopped asking. She'd found a spot near the docks, where the cargo crates provided some shelter from the wind, and she'd sat there watching the river flow past, grey and indifferent as the sky above it. Her last meal had been the day before, a piece of hardtack and some dried apples she'd found in the bottom of her satchel. The hunger was a constant ache now, but worse than that was the cold certainty that this was how her story would end. Not in the home she'd dreamed of, not surrounded by the family she'd hoped to build, but here, among strangers who wouldn't remember her name. She didn't remember deciding to lie down. One moment she was sitting, watching the dock workers load barrels onto a flatboat, and the next, The world was tilting sideways, and the rough wood of the dock was pressing against her cheek. Someone shouted something, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Her last conscious thought was a simple one. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I tried." 15 miles away, Jonas Pike was having second thoughts about coming to town at all. He stood in the dim interior of Bellwater's general store, a list of supplies in his weathered hand, and felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when he was around too many people. The store was crowded, 3 trappers arguing over the price of steel traps, a logger's wife examining bolts of fabric, a pair of drifters loitering near the tobacco, and every voice seemed too loud, every movement too close. Jonas was a tall man, lean and hard from 15 years of mountain living, with a face carved by wind and solitude. His beard was more grey than brown now, and his eyes, a pale blue that had once been warm, had taken on the colour of winter sky. He wore buckskin and homespun, practical clothes for a practical life, and he carried a hand-carved walking stick that had been his only companion on countless miles of wilderness trails. He'd been 27 when he'd first come to these mountains with his young wife, Mary, and their daughter, Emma. They'd built a cabin in a high valley, trapped and hunted, and for 10 years lived a life that was hard but good. Jonas had been happy then, in a way he could barely remember now. Mary had laughed easily and often. Emma had grown strong and curious, learning to read animal tracks before she could read words. Then came the winter, when Jonas had gone down mountain for supplies, leaving them safe, he'd thought, with plenty of firewood and provisions. He'd been gone 4 days. A spark from the hearth, the wind in the wrong direction, and by the time he'd returned, there was nothing left but ashes and 2 graves he'd dug with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the shovel. He'd stayed in the mountains after that, but he'd moved his cabin, couldn't bear to be near that valley. For 15 years he'd lived alone, speaking to no one for months at a time, venturing to Bellwater only twice a year when his supplies ran low. He preferred it that way. People meant attachment, and attachment meant loss, and he'd lost enough for 1 lifetime. That everything, Pike. The storekeeper, a balding man named Warren, was looking at him with the mix of curiosity and caution that most townspeople showed Jonas. Jonas nodded, counting out coins for the supplies: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. Not much. He didn't need much. "Heard there's going to be an early winter," Warren said, making conversation Jonas didn't want. "Snow, already falling up in the high country." "Seen it," Jonas replied, his voice rough from disuse. Warren wrapped the supplies in brown paper and twine. "You ever think about coming down to winter in town? That cabin of yours must be colder than a—" "It suits me fine." Jonas took his packages and turned to leave before Warren could continue. Outside, the afternoon was fading toward evening, the autumn sun already low over the western mountains. Jonas loaded his supplies onto his horse, a sturdy roan mare named Ida, and considered heading straight back up the mountain. But he'd promised himself he'd get everything he needed in 1 trip. It would be months before he came back to town, and he still needed to check with the trapper's supply for a new steel blade. He led Ida down toward the docks, where the trapper's supply sat in a weathered building overlooking the water. The streets were quieter now, most men having moved inside to the saloon or home to supper. The wind off the river carried a bite that spoke of the winter to come. Jonas was almost to the supply house when he saw her. At first, she was just another shape among the cargo crates, a bundle of cloth that might have been abandoned canvas or discarded goods. But something made him look twice, maybe the way the fading light caught on a pale hand, or maybe something deeper, some instinct he thought he'd buried with his family. He moved closer, his walking stick silent on the worn planks of the dock, and saw her clearly. A woman, middle-aged, thin in a way that spoke of recent hardship rather than natural build, lying motionless among the crates, with her head resting on a battered leather satchel. Her clothes were respectable but worn, her dark hair streaked with grey and coming loose from its pins. Her face, even in unconsciousness, held lines of care and sorrow, Jonas stopped 3 feet away, every instinct telling him to turn around and walk away. This wasn't his concern. People came to Bellwater and fell on hard times all the time. The town would deal with it, or it wouldn't, but either way, it had nothing to do with him. He started to turn away. Then he saw her chest rise and fall, shallow and slow, and something in that fragile movement stopped him cold. A memory rose unbidden. Mary. In those last hours after he'd pulled her from the burning cabin, her breathing just like that, shallow and failing, and him helpless to stop it. He shook his head, trying to clear the image, but his feet had already carried him closer. He knelt beside the woman, his joints protesting after the long ride to town, and reached out to check for a pulse at her neck. It was there, weak but steady. Her skin was cold to the touch. "Ma'am." His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. He looked around the dock, but there was no one nearby. The workers had all gone home or to the saloon. The boats were tied up for the night. In the distance, he could hear laughter and piano music from the waterfront establishments, but here the silence was complete except for the lap of water against the pilings. Jonas sat back on his heels, a war raging inside him. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to walk away. Go get the portmaster or the sheriff, let them deal with it. That's what the man he'd become would do, the one who'd chosen solitude over the risk of caring. But another part of him, a part he'd thought was dead, looked at this woman and saw someone who'd reached the end of their rope. Someone with no one coming to help. Someone alone in the way he understood too well. He stood and looked around one more time, as if hoping someone else would appear and take this decision out of his hands. When no one came, he let out a long breath and made his choice. Jonas bent down and carefully gathered the woman into his arms, surprised by how light she was. He picked up her satchel as well, looping it over his shoulder, and started walking back toward where he'd left Ida. The woman stirred slightly as he carried her, her eyelids fluttering. "It's all right," Jonas heard himself say, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "You're going to be all right now." He didn't know if that was true. Didn't know what he was going to do with an unconscious woman or why he was doing this at all. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her there. Couldn't walk away from someone that alone, that vulnerable, that close to the edge. As he reached his horse and carefully arranged the woman in front of him on the saddle, Jonas caught sight of his reflection in a shop window. A mountain man with a stranger in his arms, about to ride off into the wilderness together. "What the hell are you doing, Pike?" he asked himself. But he already knew the answer, even if he didn't want to admit it. He was doing the one thing he'd sworn never to do again. He was letting himself care. He clicked his tongue and turned Ida toward the mountain trail, carrying the woman away from Bellwater and toward a destination neither of them could have imagined. The journey up the mountain took 3 hours in the deepening darkness, and Catherine drifted in and out of consciousness for most of it. Jonas kept one arm around her waist, holding her steady against his chest as Ida picked her way along the familiar trail. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light through the pines, and Jonas was grateful for it. This path was treacherous enough in daylight. Twice Catherine stirred, murmuring words he couldn't make out. Once she struggled weakly against his hold, confused and frightened, and he had to speak quietly to calm her. "Easy now, you're safe. Just rest." His voice seemed to reach her even through the fog of exhaustion, and she settled back against him, her body going limp with trust that made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. Around her neck, he noticed a thin silver chain catching the moonlight. He hadn't seen it before, but now he caught glimpses of it beneath the collar of her worn dress. Something hung from it, resting against her heart, but he didn't look closer. Whatever it was hers to keep private. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became. Jonas felt Catherine shiver and shifted to shield her better from the wind. He hadn't planned for a passenger, hadn't brought an extra blanket, and the temperature was dropping fast. If he'd been alone, he would have stopped to make camp, but with Catherine in her weakened state, he needed to get her somewhere warm. His cabin sat in a small clearing at the edge of a high meadow, backed by a granite ridge that protected it from the worst of the winter winds. He'd built it himself over the course of 2 years, choosing each log with care, fitting each stone in the chimney by hand. It wasn't the home he'd shared with Mary and Emma that was ashes and memory, but it was solid and weatherproof, and had been his sanctuary for a decade. As Ida emerged from the tree line into the clearing, Jonas felt the familiar sense of arrival, but this time it was complicated by the presence of the woman in his arms. He was bringing someone into his private world, his carefully constructed solitude, and the implications of that made his stomach tight with something between anxiety and an emotion he didn't want to name. He reined Ida to a stop in front of the cabin and sat there for a moment, looking at the dark windows, the solid door, the life he'd built alone. Last chance to turn back, he thought. Last chance to take her to town, leave her at the church or the doctor's office, walk away from whatever this was becoming. But Catherine chose that moment to turn her face into his shoulder, a small, unconscious gesture of trust, and Jonas knew he'd already made his choice back at the docks. There was no turning back now. He dismounted carefully, holding Catherine against him, and carried her to the door. Getting it open while holding her was awkward, but he managed, shouldering through into the dark interior. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather, pine sap, and the dried herbs he kept hanging from the rafters. It smelled like home, though he rarely thought of it that way. Jonas laid Catherine carefully on his bed, the only bed in the single-room cabin, and lit a lamp with practiced efficiency. The light revealed a space that was spare but not uncomfortable. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat near the center. Shelves lined another wall holding supplies and tools. Everything was orderly, clean, functional. The home of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. Except now there was a woman lying unconscious in his bed, and nothing felt orderly anymore. Jonas moved quickly, building up the fire until it roared in the hearth. The cabin began to warm, but Catherine was still shivering, her lips tinged blue. He pulled a heavy quilt over her, then another, tucking them around her shoulders. He fetched water from the barrel by the door and set it to heat, then rummaged through his stores for something that might serve as broth. As he worked, he found himself studying her face in the lamplight. She was handsome rather than beautiful, with strong features and laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a life that had once held joy. Her hair, mostly unpinned now, fell across the pillow in waves of brown shot through with silver. There was something familiar in her face, though he'd never seen her before. Maybe it was just the recognition of shared grief. He'd become good at spotting it in others, the weight that never quite left the eyes. The water boiled, and Jonas made a simple broth from dried venison and herbs, letting it steep while he tended to Ida. The horse needed to be unsaddled and brushed, fed and watered, before he could settle in for the night. It was full dark by the time he finished, the forest alive with the sounds of night creatures and wind through the pines. When he returned to the cabin, Catherine was stirring. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, tracking across the unfamiliar ceiling to the strange walls to finally land on Jonas, standing in the doorway. Fear flashed across her face, and she tried to sit up, her hand going instinctively to her throat, to that silver chain he'd noticed earlier. Who are you? Where am I? Jonas held up his hands, showing he meant no harm, and stayed where he was near the door. Name's Jonas Pike. You're in my cabin, about 15 miles up the mountain from Bellwater. You collapsed at the docks. I brought you here. Catherine's breathing was rapid, her eyes darting around the cabin like a trapped animal looking for escape. I don't understand. Why would you? You needed help. Jonas kept his voice even, calm. Couldn't just leave you there. You should have. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. You should have left me alone. The defeat in those words hit Jonas harder than he'd expected. He moved slowly to the table, ladled some of the broth into a tin cup, and carried it toward the bed. "When did you last eat?" Catherine didn't answer, just watched him approach with wary eyes. He stopped a respectful distance from the bed and set the cup on the small table beside it. "It's just broth, nothing fancy, but it's warm, and it'll help." She looked at the cup, then back at him, trying to make sense of this strange man and this strange situation. "Why are you doing this?" Jonas thought about that question, about all the reasons he should have walked away and the one reason he hadn't. "Because someone needed to," he said finally. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all he could offer right now. Catherine's hand trembled as she reached for the cup. Jonas saw how weak she was, how close she'd come to the edge, and felt anger rise in his chest, not at her, but at a world that could leave someone in such a state. At a town full of people who'd walked past her without stopping. She managed to bring the cup to her lips and took a small sip, then another. Her eyes closed briefly, and Jonas saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. "There's more when you want it." Jonas moved back toward the hearth, giving her space. "You should rest. We can talk more in the morning. I don't even know your name." "Jonas Pike. Already told you that." "Catherine." She took another sip of broth. "Catherine Mercer. Mrs. Mercer." Jonas nodded, noting the title, the implication of a husband somewhere. "Widow Mercer," she corrected quietly, and there it was, the shared burden of loss that he'd recognized in her face. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Jonas busied himself banking the fire, while Catherine finished the broth with slow, careful sips. When he glanced over, he saw her examining the cabin with eyes that were clearer now, taking in the masculine space, the solitary life it represented. "This is your home," she said, not quite a question. "Has been for near about 10 years. And you live here alone." "I do." Catherine looked down at the empty cup in her hands. "I should go. In the morning, I mean. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't. This isn't proper." Jonas almost laughed at the word proper applied to his life, but he kept his face neutral. "You're in no condition to go anywhere, not for a few days at least. And there's nowhere for you to go anyway, is there?" The truth of that settled over Catherine like a weight. Her shoulders sagged, and she looked away, toward the fire. "No, there isn't." "Then you'll stay here until you're well enough to figure out what comes next." Jonas moved to the corner where he kept a bedroll and began unrolling it on the floor near the hearth. "You take the bed. I'll sleep here." "I can't. This is your bed, your home. I can't take—" "It's not a discussion, Mrs. Mercer. You're staying in the bed." Catherine started to protest again, but exhaustion was winning over propriety. She lay back against the pillow, pulling the quilts up to her chin. "I don't understand why you're being kind to me. You don't know me." "You don't owe me anything." Jonas settled onto his bedroll, his back against the warm stones of the hearth. In the lamplight, he could see the carved initials on the hearthstone, JP and MP, a reminder of another life, another time when kindness had come naturally to him. "Maybe I don't," he said quietly. "But I remember what it's like to have nowhere to go and no one to turn to." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I tried so hard. After Thomas died, I tried to keep going, to honor his memory, to make something of the life we'd planned. But everything it all fell apart. And I let it. I gave up." "You didn't give up," Jonas said firmly. "You survived. There's a difference. I was dying on those docks, but you didn't die. You're here now. That counts for something." Catherine turned her face toward the wall, and Jonas saw her shoulders shake with silent tears. He looked away, giving her privacy for her grief, and stared into the fire instead. The cabin was warm now, filled with the soft sounds of crackling wood and Catherine's quiet weeping. Jonas lay on his bedroll and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. For 15 years he'd kept the world at arm's length, had built walls around his heart that he'd thought were unbreachable. Now there was a crying widow in his bed, and those walls felt considerably less solid than they had this morning. Outside, the wind picked up, singing through the pines. Winter was coming early this year. Jonas could feel it in his bones, in the way the temperature dropped and the sky held that particular clarity that preceded snow. Another few weeks and this cabin would be cut off from Bellwater entirely, isolated by snowdrifts and ice until spring, which meant that Catherine Mercer, whoever she was and whatever had brought her to that dock, would be staying considerably longer than a few days. Jonas closed his eyes and tried not to think about what that might mean. Tried not to remember the last time he'd cared about someone, the last time he'd let someone into his carefully controlled life. Tried not to remember how that had ended. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of fire and ash, and a woman's voice calling his name from very far away. 3 weeks passed, and the mountain showed its true face. Snow fell in earnest, blanketing the clearing in white silence, and the temperature dropped until even the thick log walls felt thin against the cold. Jonas had been right. They were cut off now, the trail to Bellwater impassable until spring, and Catherine found herself grateful for the solid cabin and the company of a man who knew how to survive in this unforgiving place. The routine they'd established felt almost natural now. Jonas rose before dawn and tended to the animals Ida and 2 goats Catherine hadn't known about, kept in a small barn. She also hadn't noticed her first days here. Catherine made breakfast, packed food for Jonas if he was going far, and spent her days mending, cooking, and learning the rhythms of mountain life. She'd gained weight, her face filling out, colour returning to her cheeks. Her hands, which had been soft from months of idleness in Bellwater, were developing calluses again. She felt stronger, more like herself than she had in months. Or perhaps, she sometimes thought, she was becoming someone new entirely. Jonas was teaching her things without quite meaning to. How to read the weather in the colour of the sky, the behaviour of the birds, how to track animals by their prints in the snow, how to tell good firewood from bad, how to bank a fire so it lasted through the night. Practical knowledge, the kind that kept you alive out here. In turn, Catherine brought small changes to the cabin. She'd reorganized the pantry so things were easier to find. She'd made curtains from an old sheet she'd found in Mary's trunk. Jonas had nodded approval but said nothing. She cooked meals that were more than just fuel, adding herbs and care, and she noticed that Jonas lingered at the table now, seemed less eager to escape to the solitude of his work. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Catherine asked the question that had been building in her mind for days. "Tell me about them." "About Mary and Emma." Jonas stiffened, his hands gripping his coffee cup. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. She was light. That's the word that comes to mind. She laughed easily, saw joy in small things. "I met her in Pennsylvania, before I came west. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper, no business marrying a trapper, but she did anyway." His voice softened with memory. "Emma was just like her, curious about everything, brave in ways that scared me sometimes. She'd follow me into the woods, wanting to learn to track, to hunt. She was 8 when—" He stopped, and Catherine waited, giving him the space to continue or not. "I'd gone down mountain for supplies. Winter was coming, and I needed things I couldn't make or trade for. Mary told me to be careful, said there was weather coming. She was right, there always was, but I thought I had time." He set down his cup, his hands trembling slightly. "Fire started while I was gone. Maybe a spark from the hearth. Maybe I'll never know. The cabin we had then was in a valley, miles from here. By the time I got back, there was nothing left but ashes. Jonas, I'm so sorry. I buried them on a hillside, overlooking the valley. Stayed there 3 days before I could bring myself to leave. Then I came here, to this ridge, And I built this cabin. He gestured at the walls around them. Built it solid, built it safe, built it alone. Catherine understood then why the cabin was so carefully constructed, why every log fit perfectly, why the hearth was stone on stone with no gaps for sparks to escape. He'd built it as penance, as protection against ever failing anyone again. "That's why you live alone," she said quietly. "Not because you prefer it, but because you're afraid." Jonas's jaw tightened. "Maybe so, but fear keeps you alive. It also keeps you from living." He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and Catherine saw anger flash in his eyes. But underneath the anger was something else, recognition maybe, or the terrible admission that she was right. "What do you know about it?" he asked, his voice rough. "You had a good marriage, from what you've said. Love and loss. Yes, but you can't understand." "Can't I?" Catherine leaned forward, her own emotions rising. "You think I don't know about fear? About being so terrified of losing again that you'd rather feel nothing? I was dying on those docks, Jonas. Dying because I'd given up, because I couldn't face the thought of trying and failing, of hoping and being disappointed. And you've been dying up here for 15 years, just slower." Jonas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Look around this cabin. Mary's things in the trunk, her initials on the hearthstone that you can't bring yourself to cover up or chisel away. The photograph you keep face down because you can't stand to see their faces, but can't bear to put it away. You've made this place a shrine to your guilt. Get out." Jonas's voice was deadly quiet. "Where exactly would I go?" Catherine stood to face him. "We're snowed in, remember, so you're stuck with me and my observations, whether you like it or not." They stood there, 2 feet apart, both breathing hard, years of grief and anger and fear crackling between them like lightning. Catherine knew she'd pushed too hard, crossed a line, but part of her didn't care. She was tired of tiptoeing around his pain while ignoring her own. "Why do you care?" Jonas demanded. "Why does it matter to you how I choose to live?" "Because I'm living here too," Catherine shot back. "Because for the first time in months, I feel like I'm alive again. And part of that is because of you. Because you saved me, yes, but also because you're... She stopped, the words caught in her throat, but Jonas finished for her. "Because I'm what?" His voice was softer now, dangerous in a different way. Catherine took a breath, steadying herself. "Because you're the first person since Thomas died who's made me feel like I matter, like I'm more than just a burden or a problem to be solved. You look at me and you see me." The silence that fell then was different from before, heavy with things unsaid, with emotions too complicated to name. Jonas looked away first, his shoulders sagging. "I should go check the barn," he said, reaching for his coat. "Jonas, don't." But he was already out the door, disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight. Catherine stood alone in the cabin, her heart pounding, wondering if she'd just destroyed the fragile peace they'd built. She waited up for him, sitting by the fire with mending in her lap that she couldn't focus on. An hour passed, then 2. Finally the door opened and Jonas stepped inside, snow clinging to his hair and beard. He looked exhausted, older than his years. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You were right. About all of it." Catherine set aside her mending. "I shouldn't have said it like that. It wasn't kind." "No, but it was true." Jonas moved to sit in the chair across from her, his hands clasped between his knees. "I have been hiding up here, convincing myself it was a choice, when really it was just fear. Fear of caring again, fear of losing again, fear of being happy because happiness can be taken away." "I know," Catherine said softly. "I know because I feel it too." Jonas looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the same thing. She felt the terror of connection, the risk of opening a heart that had been broken, but also, maybe, the beginning of something worth taking that risk for. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to let someone in again." "Neither do I." Catherine reached across the space between them and took his hand. His fingers were cold from the night air, but they curled around hers with gentle strength. "But maybe we figure it out together." They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, the fire crackling softly, two wounded souls beginning the slow, frightening work of healing. After that night, something shifted between them. The careful politeness gave way to something more honest, more real. They talked more freely now, sharing memories that had been too painful to speak aloud before. Catherine told Jonas about her life with Thomas, not just the good parts, but the struggles too. The years when money was tight, when Thomas's business ventures failed, when they'd argued about whether to stay in independence or strike out for the territories. The miscarriages that had stolen their hopes for children, the slow acceptance that it would be just the two of them. The way Thomas had dreamed of the West as a new beginning, a place where they could build something lasting. Jonas, in turn, shared fragments of his life before. His childhood in Pennsylvania, learning the woods from his father, the years as a young trapper when the frontier was still wild and fortunes could be made in beaver pelts. Meeting Mary at a trading post, her father's objections, their decision to marry anyway and head west together. Emma's birth in a log cabin with only Jonas and a midwife present, the terror and wonder of holding his daughter for the first time. "I taught her to track when she was 5, Jonas said one evening, staring into the fire. "She had eyes like a hawk, could spot things I'd miss. Used to say she'd be a better hunter than me someday, and I believed it." Catherine reached over and squeezed his hand. He didn't pull away. The winter deepened, and with it came a forced intimacy that might have been unbearable if they hadn't been slowly learning to trust each other. The cabin was small, privacy limited. They worked out routines. Jonas would step outside while Catherine washed and dressed in the morning. She would busy herself with mending while he changed clothes in the evening. But there were moments when their careful choreography failed, when they'd brush against each other in the narrow space, when awareness of the other's presence became almost overwhelming. One afternoon, Catherine was cooking from her mother's recipe book, a battered old thing she'd carried in her satchel, its pages stained and worn from years of use. She was making a stew, the kind her mother had taught her, and the smell filled the cabin with warmth and memory. Jonas came in from checking the traps, snow dusting his shoulders, and stopped in the doorway. "That smell," he said, his voice catching. "Mary used to make something like that, her mother's recipe." Catherine looked up from the pot. "Would you like to try it when it's done?" "I'd like that, thank you." They ate together that evening, and Jonas was quiet, clearly lost in memory. But it wasn't the painful kind of remembering, Catherine noticed. It was softer, gentler, the kind of memory that brought a small smile rather than tears. After dinner, Catherine pulled out the recipe book and showed it to Jonas. "My mother gave this to me when I married Thomas. Said it was the most valuable thing she could pass on the knowledge of how to feed a family, how to make a house, a home." Jonas turned the pages carefully, looking at the handwritten recipes in faded ink. "It's like you carry your mother with you." "In a way, I suppose I do. Her and all the women before her who used these recipes, who wrote them down, who passed them on." Catherine paused, then added, "Sometimes I think that's what legacy really is. Not land or money or grand accomplishments, but these small things, recipes and stories, and the ways we take care of each other." Jonas looked at her then, something shifting in his expression. "You've got wisdom in you, Catherine Mercer. Just the perspective of having lived long enough to lose some things and value others." That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. The wind was howling outside, rattling the shutters, and her mind was too full of thoughts of Thomas, of Jonas, of the strange new life she was building in this mountain cabin. She rose quietly and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered clearing bathed in moonlight. Jonas's voice came from the darkness near the hearth. "Can't sleep either?" Catherine turned, surprised. She'd thought he was asleep on his bedroll. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. Wind's too loud. He sat up, the blanket falling away from his shoulders. What are you thinking about? Catherine considered lying, offering something simple and safe, but they'd moved past that kind of careful dishonesty. I was thinking about how strange life is. 6 weeks ago I was ready to die. Now I'm here, in a mountain cabin with a man I barely know, and I'm happy. Or at least, something close to it. It doesn't make sense. Jonas stood and moved to join her at the window. This close, she could feel the warmth of him, smell the pine and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his skin. Maybe sense isn't what matters. Maybe what matters is that you're here, you're alive, and you're moving forward. Are we? Catherine turned to look at him. Moving forward, I mean. Or are we both just hiding from the world in different ways? I don't know, Jonas admitted. Maybe a bit of both. They stood there in silence, watching the moonlight on the snow, and Catherine found herself hyper-aware of how close he was standing, how easy it would be to lean into him, to rest her head on his shoulder. But she didn't. Not yet. They'd come far in these weeks, but some distances needed to be crossed slowly, with care. Come spring, Jonas said quietly, we'll go see your land. See what Thomas left for you. And then you can decide what you want to do. Stay, go, build something there, sell it. Whatever you choose, I'll help however I can. Catherine felt her throat tighten with emotion. Why are you being so kind to me? Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then, because you remind me what it's like to care about someone, and because I think maybe you needed saving, and I needed to remember I could still do that. Catherine reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. Jonas looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, and in his eyes she saw everything he couldn't say, the fear and the hope, the grief and the tentative beginning of something new. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Jonas squeezed her hand gently. Get some sleep, Catherine. Morning comes early. But neither of them moved, and they stood there together at the window, watching the winter night, two hearts slowly learning to beat in rhythm again. The first thaw came in late February, a false spring that brought mild winds and dripping icicles before winter would reassert itself one last time. Catherine stood in the doorway of the cabin, breathing in air that smelled of wet earth and pine, and felt something like restlessness stirring in her chest. She'd been at Jonas's cabin for nearly 4 months now. 4 months of routine and slowly building intimacy, of learning each other's habits and histories, of becoming something more than strangers, but not quite able to name what they were to each other. The snow still lay thick on the ground, but it was melting at the edges, promising that spring and decisions would come soon. Catherine had been thinking about the land deed more lately, about Thomas's dream and what she owed to his memory, about whether she had the courage to try to build a life on that wild property, or if she should take the easier path and sell it, move to one of the settlements, start over somewhere civilized. She was sorting through her satchel, taking inventory of her few possessions, when her hand touched a folded paper she'd forgotten was there. Not the land deed that was safely stored in Jonas's strongbox, but something else. A letter, maybe, or another document. Catherine pulled it out and unfolded it, confused. It was the land deed, after all, but not the one she remembered. This one looked newer, the ink less faded. She spread it on the table and read it carefully. Her heart began to pound. The property described in this deed was different from what she remembered. Not just a wild claim 40 miles north, but 160 acres of surveyed land, with improvements. The document listed a cabin, a barn, cleared fields. It had been registered just 3 months before Thomas died, replacing an earlier, rougher claim. But that wasn't possible. Thomas had never mentioned improvements. He told her it was raw land, wilderness that would need to be tamed. Why would he have hidden this from her? Catherine read the document again, her hands shaking. At the bottom was a surveyor's notation. The land bordered the Pike property to the south, Jonas's land. The property lines were drawn clearly, with landmarks noted, and there, in smaller text at the bottom, a note from the surveyor. This deed supersedes and nullifies previous claim filed by Thomas Mercer. Original structures built by Jonas Pike circa 1838, now abandoned. Improvements include one dwelling, one outbuilding, partial fencing. Catherine felt the room tilt. She read the words again, trying to make sense of them. Jonas Pike, 1838. That was 17 years ago, when Jonas would have been building his first cabin with Mary. The cabin where they died. Understanding crashed over Catherine like cold water. The land Thomas had bought, the property she owned, wasn't empty wilderness. It was the site of Jonas's first homestead, the place where he'd lived with his family, where they died in the fire. Thomas must have bought it from the territorial office without knowing its history, and the surveyor had noted the existing structures Jonas had abandoned when he moved to this ridge. Catherine's land was Jonas's past, his grief made physical, the place he'd been fleeing for 15 years. The door opened and Jonas came in, brushing snow from his coat. He looked at Catherine and stopped. "What's wrong? You're white as a sheet." Catherine couldn't speak. She just held out the deed. Jonas took it, his brow furrowed. He read it once, quickly, then again more slowly. She watched the color drain from his face as he understood. How did you? His voice was barely a whisper. "I just found it. In my satchel. I'd forgotten." Catherine stood, moving toward him. "Jonas, I didn't know. Thomas never told me there were improvements. I thought it was just wild land. I swear I didn't know." Jonas lowered the paper, his hand trembling. "That valley. Your land is that valley. I'm so sorry." "No." Jonas backed away from her, his face a mask of shock and something darker. "No, you don't understand. You own the place where they died, where I buried them, where I—" He couldn't finish. The paper fell from his hands, and he turned away, gripping the back of a chair so hard his knuckles went white. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. "I'll sell it. I'll give it away. I'll never go there. Jonas, please." "Thomas bought it 3 months before he died," Jonas said, his voice hollow. 3 months. You've owned that land since before you even came to Bellwater, since before I found you at the docks." The implication hung in the air between them. Catherine had come west to claim land that was intimately, painfully connected to the man who'd saved her. It couldn't be coincidence. It was too cruel, too twisted. "Did you know?" Jonas turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something terrible: suspicion, betrayal. "When I found you, when I brought you here, did you know?" "No." "Jonas, I swear to you, I had no idea. I didn't even remember there were improvements listed until just now. Thomas showed me the deed once, told me about the land, but I was grieving. I wasn't paying attention to details, but you knew it bordered my property. You told me that. You told me that. When you looked at the deed, you said it was on the North Fork of the Clearwater, that it bordered your land. I didn't know before then." Jonas paced the small cabin like a caged animal. "All winter, all these months, you've owned that place, and I never looked at the deed closely. I was too busy trying to survive, trying to do heal. And then, when we settled into this routine, I stopped thinking about it. Stopped thinking about it." Jonas's laugh was bitter. "You stopped thinking about the land your husband bought, the land you were supposedly coming west to claim." Catherine felt anger flare through her grief. "Don't you dare judge me. I lost everything, Jonas. My husband, my home, my future. That land deed was the last thing on my mind when I was starving on the docks of Bellwater. And now you own my past. You own the place I've spent 15 years trying to forget." "I don't want it," Catherine shouted. "Do you think I want to own the place where your family died, where you buried them? I'll sign it over to you right now. "I don't want it either," Jonas shouted back. "I never want to see that place again. Never want to set foot in that valley." The only reason I know the land is still there is because I pay taxes on the surrounding property, and the surveyor's maps show it." They stood there, both breathing hard, the weight of this revelation crushing the fragile peace they'd built. Catherine saw clearly now how this changed everything. The trust they'd been building, the tentative feelings growing between them, all of it was built on ground that had just shifted beneath their feet. "I should leave," Catherine said quietly. "As soon as the trail is passable, I should go." "Where?" Jonas demanded. "Where will you go?" "I don't know. Somewhere. Anywhere but here." Jonas turned away, his shoulders sagging. "Catherine, what do you want me to say, Jonas? That this doesn't change anything? That we can just pretend you didn't spend all winter growing close to the woman who owns your family's graves?" The words were cruel, but they were true, and they hung in the air like poison. Jonas flinched as if she'd struck him. "I want you to tell me this isn't some cosmic joke," he said, his voice breaking. "I want to understand why, out of all the land in the territory, your husband bought that particular piece. I want to know what I'm supposed to do with this." Catherine moved to the table and sank into a chair, exhaustion washing over her. "I don't know. I don't know any more than you do." Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thomas bought it from the territorial office?" "That's what the deed says. So he wouldn't have known its history, wouldn't have known about the fire, about any of it." "No. How could he have?" Jonas sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "Just chance, then. Just terrible, random chance." "Is there any other kind?" Catherine met his eyes. "We don't get to choose how life breaks our hearts. We only get to choose what we do after." They sat in silence, the deed lying between them on the table like an accusation. Outside, the false spring continued, water dripping from the eaves, the snow turning to slush. But inside the cabin, winter had returned with a vengeance. Finally Jonas spoke. "I need time to think about this, to figure out what it means." "I understand." "Do you?" He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw all the walls going back up, all the careful defenses being rebuilt. "Because I don't. I don't understand any of this. I don't understand why you came into my life, why I felt compelled to save you, why I let myself care. And now this, it feels like the universe is laughing at me. Or maybe it's trying to tell us something," Catherine said softly. "Maybe it's saying that the past doesn't have to define the future, that even the most painful places can be reclaimed, remade. I can't go back there, Catherine. I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking you for anything except not to hate me for this." Jonas stood and moved to the window, looking out at the melting snow. "I don't hate you. I hate that this happened. I hate that something I thought was over, buried, has come back to complicate everything. I know." He turned to face her. "But I need space, need to sort through this alone." Catherine nodded, understanding that this was the best she could hope for. Not rejection, but not acceptance either. Just time. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," Jonas said. "Give us both some room to think." And before Catherine could protest, he was gathering his bedroll and heading for the door. They made camp that night on a rise overlooking the valley, far enough from the ruins to give Jonas space, but close enough to claim the land. Catherine built a fire while Jonas tended the animals, and they ate a simple meal under a canopy of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "There's something I need to do," Jonas said after they'd finished eating. "Something I should have done 15 years ago." Catherine waited, giving him space to continue. "Their graves. They're on that hillside." He pointed to a slope on the eastern edge of the valley, visible in the moonlight. "I buried them there, and I never went back. Never visited. Never said a proper goodbye. I just ran. Would you like me to come with you?" Jonas looked at her, grateful and relieved. "Please." They walked to the hillside in silence, Jonas carrying a lantern, The graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, weathered by time, but still standing. The names were barely legible now. Mary Elizabeth Pike, Emma Rose Pike, beloved wife and mother, beloved daughter. Gone, but not forgotten. Jonas knelt between the graves, and Catherine stood back, giving him privacy. She watched as he reached out and touched each cross in turn, his fingers tracing the faded letters. When he spoke, his voice was soft, meant for the two souls who rested there. Mary, Emma, I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. I'm sorry I ran away instead of honoring you properly, instead of keeping your memory alive in the world, instead of just in my heart. He paused, gathering himself. I want you to know, I want you both to know that I met someone. Her name is Catherine, and she's wonderful. She's strong and kind, and she makes me remember what it's like to hope again. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. I think you'd like her, Mary. And Emma, you'd love how stubborn she is, how she refuses to let me hide away from life. She saved me, in a way, just like you both did, once upon a time. Jonas's voice broke. I'm going to build here again, going to make this valley live again instead of leaving it to ghosts. And I hope that's okay with you. I hope you'd want me to be happy, even though it means moving forward without you. He sat there for a long time, and Catherine waited. Finally, Jonas stood and turned to her, his face wet with tears, but his expression somehow lighter than she'd ever seen it. Thank you, he said, for making me do this, for being here. Always, Catherine promised. They walked back to their camp hand in hand, and when they settled by the fire, Jonas pulled Catherine close. They sat together in silence, watching the flames, listening to the creek and the night birds and the wind in the pines. I have an idea, Jonas said finally, about what we could build here. Tell me. Not just a cabin. A home. Big enough for a family, even if that family is just the two of us. With a porch where we can watch the deer come to the creek, a proper barn for the animals, maybe eventually a root cellar, a smokehouse. Everything we'd need to live here full-time if we wanted to. That sounds wonderful, but what about your cabin on the ridge? We could keep it, use it in the winters when the snow gets too deep here, or we could sell it, let someone else make a home there. He looked at her. What would you want? Catherine thought about the cabin that had been her sanctuary, the place where she'd healed and fallen in love. I'd want to keep it. It's special to both of us. And maybe someday, maybe if we're blessed with... She stopped, suddenly shy. Jonas understood. Children? I'm 47 years old. It's probably too late for that. But maybe not. Or maybe we could. There are orphans, children who need homes. The frontier is full of them. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about a lot of things. About building a life with you. About what that life might look like. About legacy and family and everything. Jonas kissed her then, soft and gentle and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. Will you marry me, Catherine Mercer? Jonas asked. Not because it's proper or expected, but because I love you and I want to build this life with you. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to grow old with you in this valley, in that cabin we're going to build together. Catherine felt joy rising in her chest, pure and bright and overwhelming. Yes, Jonas Pike, I will marry you. I'll build with you, and grow old with you, and love you for whatever time we're given. They held each other under the stars, two people who'd lost everything and found each other, ready now to build something new from the ashes of the past. The valley stretched out below them, full of possibility, full of promise. Tomorrow they would begin the real work. But tonight they had each other, and that was everything. 6 months later, Catherine stood on the porch of the new cabin and watched the sun rise over the valley. Fall had come to the mountains, painting the aspens gold and filling the air with the crisp promise of winter. But this year, winter held no fear. This year, they were ready. The cabin behind her was solid and beautiful, built with care and love over the long summer months. Jonas had insisted on doing it right, choosing the best timber, fitting each log with precision, building a structure that would stand for generations. The stone foundation was laid on ground, blessed by a travelling preacher who'd married them in early June, their vows spoken in the meadow where Emma used to chase butterflies. Catherine heard Jonas moving inside, the familiar sounds of him building up the fire, starting coffee. She smiled and touched the wedding ring on her finger, a simple gold band they'd bought in Bellwater on a supply run, nothing fancy, but perfect in its own way. Beside it, on a chain around her neck, hung the silver ring that had belonged to Thomas. She wore both now, honouring the past while embracing the future. The door opened, and Jonas stepped out onto the porch, 2 tin cups of coffee in his hands. He'd filled out over the summer, the haunted look gone from his eyes. Replaced by something that looked remarkably like contentment, he handed her a cup and wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Beautiful morning," he said. "Every morning's beautiful here. That's because you're here to see them with." Catherine laughed and leaned into him, breathing in the smell of coffee and pine and Jonas. This man who'd saved her life that night at the docks, who'd carried her broken body up a mountain and into his heart, who'd faced his deepest fears because she'd asked him to, because together they were stronger than they'd ever been alone. "I was thinking," Catherine said, "about taking a trip to Bellwater before the snow comes. We'll need supplies, and I'd like to check at the territorial office, see if anyone's been asking about land or looking for work." "Looking for work?" Jonas raised an eyebrow. "We can't do everything ourselves, Jonas. If we're going to make this place productive, we'll need help, maybe a hired hand or two. And I was thinking, there are always people in Bellwater who are down on their luck, who need a second chance." Jonas understood. "Like you were. Like we both were, in different ways. This valley, this land, it gave us a second chance. Maybe we could pass that along." Jonas was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he nodded. "We'd have to be careful who we chose. Not everyone's as deserving as you. Or as stubborn. Definitely not as stubborn. There's only one of you, thank God." Catherine elbowed him gently, and they both laughed. It felt good to laugh, to tease, to be light with each other. They'd both carried sorrow for so long that joy felt almost foreign, but they were learning to embrace it. A movement in the meadow caught Catherine's eye. 3 deer, a doe and 2 fawns, picking their way down to the creek, just as Jonas had described from his memories. Life continuing, as it always did, beautiful and persistent and wild. "Mary would have loved this," Jonas said softly, following her gaze. "Seeing the valley alive again, seeing what we've built. I hope she does see it. I hope they both do. Somehow." Jonas pulled Catherine closer. "I used to think happiness was something that could only be taken away, that the smart thing was to avoid it, to stay numb and safe. But you taught me that safety isn't really living, that the risk of loss is worth it for the chance at this." "At what?" "At this moment. This life. You." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I love you, Catherine Pike. I never thought I'd say those words again, never thought I'd feel this way. But here we are." "Here we are," Catherine echoed, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "Building a life, making a home, taking it one day at a time." They stood together on the porch as the sun climbed higher, warming the valley, bringing the world to life. Inside the cabin, Catherine's recipe book sat on a shelf next to Jonas's father's hunting knife. On the mantel above the new hearthstone sat the photograph of Mary and Emma, no longer hidden, but honoured. And beside it, a tintype of Catherine and Thomas from their wedding day, 2 couples, 2 lives, all part of the story that had brought Jonas and Catherine to this moment. The cornerstone of the new cabin bore fresh carving, the letters deep and clear, C, M, and JP. Not replacing the old initials that still marked the ridge cabin, but adding to them, building on the foundation of what had come before. You ready for winter? Jonas asked, his arm around Catherine's waist. With you? Always. It'll be hard work, keeping the animals fed, the cabin warm, managing in the snow. We've survived worse. We'll survive this too. Together. Jonas looked down at her. This woman who'd collapsed at a desolate port 6 months ago, with nothing left to live for, and marveled at the strength in her, at the life they'd built from ashes and grief and unexpected grace. You know what I was thinking? Catherine said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. What's that? That lonely night at the docks, when I thought no one was coming to save me, I was wrong. Someone did come, and more than that, I saved him right back. We saved each other. Jonas tightened his arm around her. That we did. They turned and went inside together, ready to face whatever the day would bring. A place where loss had once reigned now held life again, held hope, held the future they were building, one careful, loving day at a time. Sometimes the end of one life is the beginning of another. Sometimes rescue comes from the most unexpected places. And sometimes two wounded souls, given the courage to try, can build something stronger together than either could alone. The mountains stood watch. The creek sang its ancient song. And in a valley that had known sorrow, joy bloomed again like wildflowers after winter, stubborn and bright and impossibly beautiful.